Since its creation by Henry VIII, the ships of the Royal Navy have sailed along Dorset's coast or dropped anchor in its waters. It was off Portland that the English fleet first attacked the Spanish Armada and fought the Dutch. Dorset's ports and harbours provided seamen for Nelson's navy, including 4 captains who saw action at Trafalgar. As sail gave way to steam and England's wooden walls were replaced by the first ironclads, Portland's harbour was transformed into one of Britain's mightiest naval bases. It was here that the torpedo was developed. Early submarines made their maiden dives. An aeroplane first took off from a moving ship. Through the war-laden years of the 20th century, Portland played a major part in the defence of our island shores. The ill-fated Royal Naval Division was based at Blandford. High explosives were made at the Royal Naval Cordite factory overlooking Poole Harbour. Although the challenges of war had brought rapid advances in submarine design and safety, it still took a special breed of sailor to venture below the waves. The sea off Dorset continued to claim victims. On 10th of January 1924, HM submarine L24, on a fleet exercise in Lyme Bay, was rammed by the 29,000-ton battleship HMS Resolution. Resolution was rising and dipping in a swell and came down on the ascending submarine. The sub sank instantly, with a loss of her entire crew of 43. She lies at 52 metres down, and the angle of her hydroplanes indicate that she was trying to make a hard dive to avoid the collision. HM submarine M2 left Portland at 9 a.m. on the 26th of January 1932 to take part in routine exercises. The alarm was raised when M2 failed to return to port in late afternoon. Search vessels raced to West Bay, but there was no sign of the submarine or her crew. It was a week before the submarine was located using ASDIC sonar. The M2 was of a revolutionary design built for the Royal Navy in 1918. A hangar and catapult launch were installed for a folding wing seaplane, a tiny Parnell Pitot, making the M2 the world's first submarine aircraft carrier.
We are here. I want you to search for shipping in this direction. Over. Step off, now clear.
It appears that the submarine had commenced diving before the hangar doors were fully closed. Most of her crew of 60 remain entombed in her hull, which is still on the seabed. In the years between the wars, Britain's role as the world's leading naval power was slipping away. Various international conferences and treaties strictly limited expenditure on weapons and warships, but the country's economy was in a parlous state anyway. The Royal Navy had to make do with what it had, but every opportunity was taken to show off what power it still possessed. The great battleships regularly came to Weymouth and Portland to exercise, and the noise and spectacle of the gun firing never failed to impress those on shore. Ships of the Atlantic Fleet used Portland as a base for exercises. Anti-submarine and minesweeping flotillas were based here. Here we see the heavy 15-inch guns of the great battlecruiser HMS Hood during manoeuvres off Dorset in 1926. HMS Repulse is following. The Hood's log of June 1922 records that she departed from Weymouth for Swanage Bay to conduct submarine attack exercises. On her way back she practised her 15-inch guns. The Hood often headed tactical exercises of the Atlantic Fleet off of Portland. In port, between exercises, like many capacious ships, the Hood often hosted concert parties. Ashore, the towns livened up when descended upon by thousands of officers and men from the fleets. The sheer size and power of HMS Hood made her stand out every time she came to Dorset. Searchlight displays in Weymouth Bay and Portland Harbour through the interwar years were truly impressive. Shafts of light darting at crazy angles across the sky, brightly illuminating the underside of any passing cloud, was a sight never to be forgotten. Powerful carbon arc searchlights fitted to naval vessels were vital components of the anti-aircraft strategy before the development of acoustic and radar devices. Sport was always essential for the Royal Navy. This was a match between HM Minesweepers and HMS Coventry in the 1930s, played on fine recreation grounds laid out near Castletown in 1905-7. The fields survived the departure of the Navy from the area, only to be built over in 2011. In the mid-1930s, the battleships Nelson and Rodney practised anti-aircraft gunnery in Weymouth Bay against a remote-controlled Queen Bee target plane. This is the battleship HMS Nelson firing her powerful 16-inch guns off Dorset. Commissioned in 1930, Nelson was the flagship of the Home Fleet and saw action throughout the Second World War. The pride of Britain's senior service was seen at its best at the many Royal Naval reviews in the first half of the 20th century. Most reviews were at Spithead, but Weymouth and Portland also experienced several spectaculars. HMS Courageous hosted King George V for his review of the fleet on the 12th of July 1932. This was his first visit since he was an active naval officer here before the Great War. Courageous had been laid down in 1915 and in 1928 became one of the first ships to be rebuilt as a proper aircraft carrier. By 1936, tensions with Germany were rising rapidly. prompting a major rearmament scheme. Investment in naval hardware had been at rock bottom in the 1920s and early 1930s. However, even by 1939, only one completely new aircraft carrier had been built, HMS Ark Royal. Fierce weather greeted the arrival in Dorset of the uncrowned King Edward VIII in November 1936 to inspect the newly rebuilt establishment HMS Osprey. On the arrival of the royal train at Portland, the sea, whipped up by a raging gale, broke over Chesil Beach and flooded the station. His Majesty was towed into a siding in his carriage with floodwater up to its axles, and he slept through it all. Next morning, thousands of would-be welcomers, along with the security police, were stuck on the mainland. The King's car then ploughed through the water, cheered on to the naval base by rain-coated crowds.
HMS Courageous, the aircraft carrier. This was not an inspection but a smoking concert. The royal visitor watched a show that proved once again that the British sailor can do anything. The next day the fleet presented a magnificent spectacle dressed in Portland Harbour as King Edward arrived for various inspections at the coaling jetty. Submarines were not forgotten in His Majesty's exhaustive tour of the silent service. Last inspection on board HMS Faulkner concluded the visit. His Majesty expressed great satisfaction with all that he had seen. The appearance of ships and men, he said, was excellent. Royal congratulations for our wonderful Navy.
The guns of the Home Fleet's flagship HMS Nelson boomed their salute. This turned out to be one of his last engagements as monarch, for within a month he had announced his abdication. Successive submarine depot ships were stationed in the harbour to mother the reserve and active submarines. HMS Illustrious was originally a German civilian liner which was captured in 1914 and converted to a submarine depot ship. Then came Vulcan, which was relieved by HMS Titania in 1930. The 1938 Royal Review of the Home Fleet was graced by the presence of King George VI, his brother the Duke of Kent and Lord Louis Mountbatten. From the flagship Nelson in Weymouth Bay they watched colourful and impressive manoeuvres, demonstrating Britain's rule of the waves. No doubt the King also reflected on his days as a young midshipman at Portland.
Uniform of Admiral of the Fleet. This visit had many memories. Among them that of the Punch and Judy show on the Esplanade, which he had watched 30 years before. Then His Majesty left in the royal barge for his yacht, the Victoria and Albert. At night there was a grand concert on board the aircraft carrier Courageous.
A short time ago, we gave this same show. We were dressed in these shorts and these blouses. As we frolicked about, from a girl came a shout. Why look there, old men without trousers?
we've had a very good show here tonight. And I thank you all very much. And I wish you good night. Hey! Hip, hip, hip!
The King returned in August 1939 on the last excursion of the elegant royal yacht Victoria and Albert. Ominously, war was just 3 weeks away, and of the ships proudly assembled, nearly half were to be lost in the coming conflict. For 2 hours the royal barge beat against a strong northeasterly wind between the long lines of ships in Weymouth Bay. Leading the fleet was the ill-fated aircraft carrier Courageous.
Taking the barge from the royal yacht to HMS Nelson, His Majesty went on to the bridge of the flagship when the fleet went into action. On the Nelson, the King was received by the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Sir Charles Forbes. With the King were the Duke of Kent and Lord Louis Mountbatten, and members of the Board of Admiralty. Early morning mist and patches played tricks with visibility as the home fleet put to sea. But a more inspiring spectacle of majesty and power is hard to imagine. One of the most amazing examples of our Navy's efficiency came next, a demonstration of anti-aircraft gunfire. The Queen Bee flew overhead, Britain's miracle plane that flies without a pilot, and the rattle of pom-poms shot the air and brought the plane crashing down to the sea. Manoeuvres ended with a mass attack of destroyers upon the battle fleet, a wonderful picture of sparkling sea and the steel ships that guard our shores, our Navy that still maintains the freedom of the seas.
At dusk, thousands of fairy lights were switched on, drawing a scintillating profile of each of the 130 ships stretching across the bay. Captain W.R. Fell witnessed maritime Dorset's descent into war in 1939. He said, "As the last few weeks of peace were used up, Portland woke from its long sleep and became a seething hive of ships and activity. All 5 of my H-boats were fully manned when the warning signal, 'Prepare for war,' came, sending cold shivers down many spines. Then suddenly Portland was empty. We woke one morning to find the harbour cleared. Titania and her flotilla had left for their war station at Blyth. All the frigates, corvettes, sloops and destroyers had vanished, and only the old Alecto and her H-boats and a few harbour craft remained. There was an uncanny hush before the storm broke over us that was to sweep all that we had known before it." Captain Fell recalled, "The morning of September the 3rd, 1939, broke clear, calm and hot. We moved restlessly about, expecting we knew not what, but thinking all the time about what we remembered of War I, its courage, its fury. At 11 a.m. they gathered around the wireless in the wardroom. They heard Big Ben chime, and then Mr. Chamberlain's solemn voice telling them that they were at war. A signalman waited, listening at the door, then came to me with the message, 'H31 proceed with all dispatch to rendezvous with Kelly, 4 miles 260 degrees from Portland Bill, and carry out ASP 6. The war had come for me. HMS Kelly had been completed just 10 days before, and came straight to Portland to work up prior to taking up war station. In command of her and of the entire 5th Destroyer Flotilla was Captain Lord Louis Mountbatten. Action came soon. On day 2 of the war, Kelly and HM Destroyer Acheron detected a supposed U-boat off Portland and duly deployed a depth charge. 80 feet below, a huge explosion rocked Captain Fell's H-31, With an almighty crash and flash, and lights went out and shattered, men fell sprawling, he said. Mountbatten had nearly made the first submarine kill of the war, but not one he would have been proud of. H-31 shot up and raced well clear before Kelly returned and dropped 4 more depth charges. On the 17th of September, Kelly rushed to the western approaches to take on survivors from the aircraft carrier Courageous, sunk that day by U-boat U-29, with the loss of 519 lives. After completing her work up at Portland, Kelly was deployed to the Mediterranean, where, off Crete on the 23rd of May 1941, she too was attacked and sunk. Mountbatten was one of 38 survivors, but 128 men died. A year later, Mountbatten's exploits in the doomed Kelly inspired the great patriotic war film In Which We Serve, directed by David Lean and Noel Coward. Appropriately, the Ministry of Information cleared security for location shots to be filmed at Portland. Early in the war, Dorset found itself in an extremely vulnerable position, far more so than in the First World War. The fall of France in 1940 brought its coast within a 20-minute flight range for the Luftwaffe. The Navy lost no time in deploying discreet defences at all potential invasion points, including the harbours of Poole, Weymouth and Portland. Large fleets in Portland Harbour could no longer be adequately defended, and the Royal Navy's main warships were desperately needed at other fronts. The H-class submarines departed in early May 1940, and most other naval ships followed, in a move vindicated by the German air raids which followed. During the long, hot summer that history now calls the Battle of Britain, Portland Weymouth was the target of more formation aerial raids than anywhere else in the country after London and Liverpool. On the outbreak of war, HMS Foylebank was converted from a civilian freighter to an anti-aircraft ship for the defence of convoys. Through June 1940 she was working up in the Channel and moored overnight in Portland Harbour, but she was spotted by German reconnaissance. On the 4th of July, Foylebank's own radar picked up aircraft approaching at 30 miles away. Being still at her moorings, she was a stationary target, when at 0840 a wave of 33 bombers appeared out of the sun from the east. After sweeping around Verne Hill, they paired off to dive-bomb the ship. Her guns blazed defiantly, but she was overwhelmed by the ferocious attack. A pall of smoke rose high into the clear sky as she was engulfed in fire. This was the Luftwaffe's first major attack on Dorset during the Second World War. The attack lasted just 8 minutes. 23-year-old leading seaman Jack Mantle remained at his damaged gun, continuing firing at the diving planes. His leg was badly mangled, and then he got hit in the chest, but he kept firing to the last. There were numerous acts of bravery that day, but for his tenacity Jack was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, the only one to be won by the Navy in British home waters. This young hero's name lives forever in the annals of Dorset's maritime history. Several other vessels were sunk that sunny morning, but out of the Foylebank's crew of 19 officers and 279 crew, 176 men were killed. Intense raids continued by day and by night, and several merchant ships were mined off the shambles. Block ships were prepared to blockade Weymouth and Poole harbours, and loaded torpedo tubes were installed on the Portland breakwater heads to cover the ship channels. The shore establishment HMS Osprey was cleared in late 1940, and the whole training and anti-submarine operation was transferred to Scotland. In the vacated buildings, a new coastal forces base, HMS Attack, was commissioned in January 1941. In September 1942, what was described as the Stone frigate, HMS B, was established in guest houses and various other buildings close to Weymouth Harbour. Working up involved morning lectures in the Alexandra Gardens Theatre, which also doubled as a canteen, and torpedo and gunnery firing practices in the bay. Within 6 months, 17 boats from B were undertaking full-scale coastal forces exercises with realistic night attacks. Work was stepped up at the Whitehead's torpedo works at White Regis, where some 1,500 people were now employed. The factory was obviously a prime target, and it was bombed on the 1st of May 1941. Despite heavy damage, torpedo production continued unabated. All Dorset coastal towns were now heavily involved in the naval war effort. The naval dockyard at Portland was extremely busy. The yard was involved in the adaptation of the Royal Naval Auxiliary Hospital at Sherborne, and on a temporary Royal Naval Hospital at Minturn House, once the home of Admiral Robert Digby, the captain at Trafalgar. In 1940, the Fleet Air Arm acquired the premises of the Royal Motor Yacht Club in Poole Harbour for the Royal Naval Air Station sandbanks. Based there were Royal Naval Air Squadrons with 18 seaplanes. A vacated RAF site at Hamworthy was commissioned as an amphibious training base, HMS Turtle, in October 1942. It was a combined operations centre for some 4,000 American and Canadian and British troops arriving for training and beach exercises in preparation for the D-Day landings. The wide and complex expanse of Poole Harbour was ideal for assault training, and night landing exercises were carried out on Brownsea Island and at Shell Bay. As preparations for D-Day gathered pace, the physical work around Dorset's coastal towns intensified. In February 1944, King George VI, Winston Churchill and Generals Eisenhower and Montgomery arrived by royal train at Swanage to watch Allied forces practising amphibious operations at Studland Bay. Clandestine operations were stepped up. By April 1944, British shore radar could detect German boats as far away as Cherbourg Harbour. Beach landing exercises on a huge scale were carried out at Poole, at Studland and at Weymouth, and at Slapton Sands in Devon. In Exercise Tiger, on the evening of 27th of April 1944, a convoy of 8 landing ship tanks, LSTs, with 4,000 men aboard, headed across Lyme Bay for landing practice at Slapton. After midnight and out of the darkness, 9 fast German torpedo boats suddenly appeared. 3 LSTs were torpedoed, 2 sank and 1 was severely damaged, resulting in the death of 749 US men, 4 times more than were lost by Force U in its D-Day landing in France. Hundreds of bodies were washed up on Chesil Beach and taken to Castletown Pier, Portland. The whole tragic episode was kept in utmost secrecy to avoid alerting the enemy to the strategy. This was the most costly training incident for US forces during the entire Second World War. The idea of constructing floating mulberry harbours to be conveyed to the French coast was conceived in 1943. Some of the steel bombardment sections were tested in Weymouth Bay and strung together by the Royal Navy. As D-Day approached, 85 US and British tugboats were readied to tow 150 gigantic floating concrete Phoenix blocks across the channel, which together with the bombardons were to form the huge breakwaters. Despite the total destruction of the American segment by storm, for the rest of the year and into 1945, the Mulberry Harbours successfully sheltered hundreds of vessels of all sizes and made a huge contribution to the success of the Allied assault. On the 1st of May 1944, Portland Weymouth was formally commissioned as the United States Navy Advanced Amphibious Base. Tight security greeted the King when he arrived at the base on the 25th of May, along with Winston Churchill and the Free French leader, General de Gaulle, to see the preparations and the greatest gathering of ships local waters had ever seen. By the 5th of June there was a huge concentration of shipping across Weymouth Bay and Portland Harbour. Thousands of US troops boarded landing crafts at Weymouth, and tanks and vehicles were loaded at Portland. Everything was ready to go, but heavy weather caused a 24-hour postponement. Force U had already sailed from Devon, but the gale forced them back to Weymouth Bay, which became even more congested. Then, by midnight on the 5th of June, the whole area had virtually emptied of ships. Throughout the night there was a continuous drone of troop-carrying planes and towed gliders flying over Dorset to Normandy. The mighty multinational Force O headed for Omaha Beach. As for the action on the French shores, the rest is history, but German mines and E-boats still caused casualties to Allied ships and supply ships in the Channel. On the morning of 13th of June, the destroyer HMS Boadicea was hit by a torpedo dropped from a Junkers 88. She exploded and sank within minutes, 16 miles southwest of Portland, and there were only 12 survivors. When victory in France had been secured, a US Army message to Portland and Weymouth said, "You are the biggest little port in the world. You have been wonderful." Poole was the third largest embarkation point for D-Day landings of Operation Overlord. 81 landing craft left Poole Harbour for Omaha Beach with American troops and US Army Rangers. As the war was brought to a conclusion, several surrendered German submarines were brought to Dorset. The U-249 was the first German submarine to surrender at the end of the war on the 9th of May 1945, escorted into Weymouth by the frigates Amethyst and Magpie. The white ensign was raised on her conning tower, and she was then moved to Portland. A succession of surrendering U-boats followed, and all were taken to Castletown for examination. As hostilities ended, Dorset was faced with years of recovery. 10,000 naval and military personnel left Portland-Weymouth, and thousands more dispersed from the east of the county. The ports, harbours and boatyards reverted to their peacetime roles. But new threats were emerging, and despite being virtually broke, the country felt the need to maintain a strong navy. HMS Osprey returned from Scotland in 1946. In the following year, it was commissioned as HM Underwater Detection Establishment, UDE, for scientific and communications research. The anti-submarine flotilla also returned to its original base in Portland. The Phoenix units of the Mulberry Harbour were put to good use after the war. 10 of the huge units were towed to Portland in 1946 to provide shelter for the site of a new long pier within the harbour. This was later called the Queen's or Q Pier, which greatly extended the port's berthing capacity, including the latest battle-class destroyers. It was completed in the early 1950s. The Mulberry Harbour units were later towed away, apart from 2 which were again positioned as gigantic permanent windbreaks for Q Pier. They are now scheduled monuments. Battleships, destroyers and Castle-class frigates resumed their traditional spring cruises from Portland, albeit with many fewer ships than before the war. The Royal Naval Training Squadron, the Portland Squadron, was established in 1948. That year, the cruisers and destroyers of the 3rd Escort Flotilla were extras in the film Morning Departure, starring Richard Attenborough and John Mills. Filmed partly off Weymouth and Portland, it was about the ordeals of a submarine that failed to surface after trials, so it was close to home for those who had witnessed such disasters for real. In 1946, the task of testing the revolutionary Sikorsky R-4B Hoverfly helicopter for the Navy was given to HMS Osprey. Dorset witnessed more history being made when Lieutenant Alan Bristow made the first landing of a helicopter on a Royal Naval ship, the frigate HMS Helmsdale. Lieutenant K. Reid made another pioneering landing off Portland on the 1st of February 1947 onto the deck of HMS Vanguard as she departed with the King and Queen and the 2 princesses for the royal tour of South Africa. Vanguard was the Navy's biggest, most powerful and last ever battleship. After her 1944 launch by Princess Elizabeth, Vanguard was frequently in Dorset waters. She was based at Portland from 1949 to 1951, heading the training squadron, flying the flag of C&C Home Fleet for the seasonal cruises. Regrettably, tragedies did not end with the war. In 1948, the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious was at Portland. On the 17th of October, many of the young men enjoyed a break ashore at Weymouth. On their late evening return in the ship's pinnaces, the sea was already whipped up by a squall rising to gale force. After passing through the breakwater entrance, one started shipping water. Those aboard tried desperately to bail out with everything they could lay their hands on, but it was to no avail, and the pinnace sank with the loss of 29 men. In a moving ceremony in October 2010, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Mark Stanhope, unveiled a stone memorial to the tragedy at Portland Marina. HMS Maidstone was the large mothership for the 2nd and 7th Submarine Flotilla. She was moored almost permanently in Portland from 1946. She departed in 1959 when Portland ceased to be a submarine base. At 8:30 a.m. on the 16th of June 1955, I was on a school bus on the Portland to Weymouth causeway. I looked across the harbour to see a huge plume of smoke billowing skywards from the southeast corner of the harbour. This was the moment that an explosion ripped through the submarine Sidon and instantly killed 12 of the crew. It was caused by the premature detonation of volatile high-test hydrogen peroxide propellant in a torpedo tube. HMS Sidon was an S-class submarine with the Portland Training Squadron lying alongside the depot ship Maidstone. 43 men managed to escape, and 27-year-old Lieutenant Surgeon Charles Rhodes dashed onto the sinking sub and pulled out 5 men. Tragically, he was suffocated while trying to rescue the 6th. A memorial stone for the 13 victims of the Sidon disaster now stands on Portland Heights, overlooking the harbour. Submarine technology was advancing rapidly, and the Admiralty prepared to move towards nuclear propulsion. It was arranged for the new USS Nautilus to visit Portland in October 1957 to enable defence experts to inspect the world's first nuclear-powered submarine at close quarters. Just 5 months later, a second nuclear submarine, USS Skate, surfaced off Portland and slid into the harbour after making a record-breaking crossing of the Atlantic in 8 days, 11 hours, submerged all the way. In August 1958, the USS Nautilus made a truly historic voyage from Pearl Harbor, Honolulu, on a perilous voyage which took her under the ice of the North Pole. Her first port of call again was Portland, England, where the world's press and news film cameramen were there to record the occasion. It was a proud day for Dorset. Nuclear armament brought heightened fears in the Cold War, and the Navy regarded underwater warfare as one of the main threats to all forms of shipping. The Admiralty thus embarked on a huge expansion of the secret experimental research work carried out at HMS Osprey. Portland was now one of the UK's busiest naval ports. A helicopter anti-submarine warfare squadron of Whirlwind helicopters was formed, and construction started on the nation's first naval helicopter station at the Mere, Portland. A landing strip was formed from playing fields. 2 hangars were built, and a large fleet canteen became the operations centre. 24th of April 1959 was an auspicious day for the Royal Navy in Dorset, when Admiral Sir Manly Power commissioned the Royal Naval Air Station as part of HMS Osprey. 5 days after the opening of the Royal Naval Air Station in April 1959, the Queen and Prince Charles arrived for the commissioning of Britain's largest warship, HMS Eagle. After the formalities, the young prince steered the aircraft carrier out in the Channel. 16 years later, as the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles had command of his own ship at Portland, HMS Bronnington. Among his tasks in this wooden-hulled coastal minesweeper was monitoring Soviet submarines in the Channel. Earlier, in March 1957, Prince Charles's great-uncle, the First Sea Lord, Earl Mountbatten, drove from Romsey to Portland Naval Base, a visit which was to change the course of the Royal Navy's role in Dorset. There had been doubts about the value of Portland as a naval base, but after watching manoeuvres and exercises, Mountbatten was in no doubt. Many of Portland's assets were unmatched. Its fine harbour with minimal tides, proximity to the open sea, well-equipped berths, facilities for fuelling, small ship repairs and recreation, degaussing and noise ranges, and half a century of anti-submarine development, Mountbatten regarded this as an ideal training base. Traditionally, sea exercises had been ad hoc, with crews often regarding trials as battles of wits to convince the monitors of their efficiency. A revolution in the working up of Her Majesty's ships was heralded by Lord Mountbatten's 1958 white paper, The Way Ahead. A new organisation under a flag officer sea training introduced a new rigorous exercise system. For 4 decades, the acronym FOST, F-O-S-T, was said to make the hardest naval souls quake in their steaming boots. In the autumn of 1958, The first ship to be subject to FOST was the Salisbury-class aircraft detection frigate HMS Llandaff. Ships were tested at the beginning of their commission, and complex threats with many unexpected and surprised war scenarios tested the initiative of officers and crews alike. Day or night, ships could be subject to surprise attacks by submarines, planes and helicopters, compounded by simulated attacks by destroyers and fast patrol boats. So realistic were the challenges that nobody in a ship's company could escape surprise, shock and terror in equal measures.
Starboard 15, okay, 075.
The fire aft in Sierra section is top priority for
The workup programme lasted up to 8 weeks, but the action peaked in the weekly Thursday War. The FOST system at Portland was so successful that it set world standards in the training and workup of ships, and over the years every NATO country sent ships there to be prepared to a high state of readiness. NATO's power was always greater than the sum of its parts, so the formation of the world's first permanent multinational naval squadron was a logical move. The inauguration ceremony of the Standing Naval Force Atlantic took place in 1968 at Portland Naval Base, an honour indeed for Dorset. In this force, ships from all Atlantic Alliance nations trained and operated as a single team. The Standing NATO Maritime Group 1, as it's now called, continues in the 21st century as a unique model of international naval cooperation. The Royal Naval Helicopter Base at Portland grew from strength to strength. Expansion in the 1970s made HMS Osprey the largest and busiest helicopter base in Europe. Over 3 decades, no less than 12 training squadrons prepared both air crews and ground crews for frontline services in frigates and destroyers. In 1971, a strange-looking 3,400-ton vessel with a block-like aft superstructure was towed into Portland Harbour. Motionless on a fixed mooring, the RDV Crystal was an underwater acoustic research laboratory used by the Admiralty scientists at Portland. A succession of helicopter types was introduced at the Royal Naval Air Station for anti-submarine warfare, training and ship-to-shore personnel transport, supporting destroyers and frigates. From 1964, the robust torpedo-carrying Wasps became the mainstay. The Westland Whirlwind was the first British helicopter built specifically for submarine detection duties. Then came the more powerful Wessex Mark III, with its advanced radar and dipping sonar devices. The Mark V version was used in commando roles, and from 1976 made a huge impact on the safety of the Dorset coast with its search and rescue activities. The immensely successful Lynx is an all-weather multi-purpose helicopter. It was introduced to the Royal Navy at Portland in 1976. The remote British Falkland Islands were invaded by Argentina on the 2nd of April 1982, triggering the Falklands conflict. The rigorous training exercises provided by FOST immediately proved their worth. Virtually all the Royal Navy's combat ships active in the Falklands conflict had been worked up at Portland. A few months earlier, after a spell at Portland, HMS Sheffield had spent time next to an Argentine crew. One officer recalled, "When we heard that we were fighting Argentina, it seemed very strange. A year ago, they were our friends. Now we were fighting them." Sheffield was the first Royal Naval ship lost through enemy action since 1945. After picking up survivors from the bombed HMS Antelope, many with horrible injuries, one captain remarked, "Throughout the whole thing it was noticeable that calmness reigned supreme. Maybe all that training at Portland had paid off in the long run." Royal Marines, with the Special Boat Service from Poole, played a heroic central role in the recapture of the distant islands from the Argentinians. Both air crew and ground crew from HMS Osprey's helicopter squadrons operated on ships in the heat of the Falklands conflict. The Falklands episode exposed the country's fallacy of concentrating on the perceived threat from the Soviet Union in Europe, whilst disregarding more far-flung areas of potential conflict. The demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War radically changed the Royal Navy's outlook. By the late 1980s, some 90 warships and auxiliaries were passing through Portland's FOST each year for exercise. Generations of kings and royal princes gained their naval experience in Dorset. Prince Andrew followed his elder brother, Prince Charles, by joining the Royal Navy in 1979. After active service as a helicopter pilot in the Falklands War, he transferred to the links at Portland Naval Air Station in 1983. 4 years later, he became helicopter warfare instructor of 702 Naval Air Squadron at Osprey. In 1990, now as the Duke of York, he was appointed flight commander pilot of the links on HMS Campbelltown, the flagship of the North Atlantic NATO force. The air station now employed 1,500 personnel and was also home to 772 Squadron with its Sea King Mark IV helicopters. These were used for transporting personnel and stores, as well as flight deck and sea trials, photography and search and rescue. Having given a firm assurance in March 1982 that there were no plans to run down or close Portland Naval Base, the Navy embarked on a major redevelopment scheme, including a new headquarters for the Queen's Harbour Master and £30 million accommodation buildings for officers and ratings at Castletown. No sooner had the new works at Portland been completed in 1989 than the Cold War ended, causing a rapid reappraisal of Western forces. The Royal Navy had declined in strength steadily since 1960, when it was still the world's second largest navy. Now, in 1990, the government used the peace dividend opportunity to force through unprecedented cuts in defence expenditure. From 1992, the Navy lost 33% of its uniformed personnel, down to 41,000 in 1997. Over the same period, the frigate and destroyer force reduced from 45 to 35 ships. 3 of our 15 nuclear submarines were taken out of service, and the conventional submarine force was completely eliminated. A highlight of the year for thousands of Dorset people was the annual Portland Navy Days. At their peak, tens of thousands of people attended the 2-day events, and the last Navy Days in July 1990 was still a spectacular occasion. Air displays included the Battle of Britain and Royal Naval historical flights, a Vulcan bomber flew low over the crowds, a deafening Sea Harrier jump jet hovered improbably over the harbour, a Catalina flying boat landed and took off, Royal Marine Commandos from Poole made realistic assaults, and spirits were lifted by the Royal Marines Band. The Navy Days were always memorable, and their demise left a gap in the county's popular tourist calendar. The closure of Portland Naval Base was formally announced to the House of Commons on the 12th of November 1992. All the main naval functions, except the Marines and SBS at Poole, were to transfer from Dorset to Plymouth, although the Royal Naval Air Station, HMS Osprey, would remain open for now. There was vehement opposition to the closure of the Portland base, not only from the South Dorset communities, who faced huge economic and job losses, but also from all ranks of naval personnel. For more than 2 centuries, the sea off the Dorset coast had proved ideal for the exercise of HM ships. Portland had an unmatched harbour of refuge and was firmly established as one of the country's prime naval ports. Its flag officer sea training was considered the best in the world. However, the rapid changes in technology and the nature of sea warfare pointed to some advantages in moving the naval operations to Plymouth. In particular, submarines could now be detected at a range of 200 miles, whereas the channel off Dorset at its narrowest is only 57 miles, 93 kilometres wide, limiting its training value. Coordination of submarine, ship and aircraft movements was considered easier from Plymouth with its wide arc across the western approaches. But fundamentally, it was a cost-saving move. NATO warships continued to exercise out of Portland to the last. The cuts were not confined to the uniform navy. In September 1992, the Admiralty confirmed that 3 Dorset research bases were to close. The Defence Research Agency establishments at Southwell and East Weirs on Portland and Holton Heath. The RTV Crystal Floating Laboratory had already been axed that year. Between them, these facilities employed thousands of people, and as with the departure of the Navy, their closure would have a profound effect on the local economy. For a century, these top-secret establishments and their predecessors had played a key role in the defence of the nation, and among the post-war achievements by their scientists were underwater detection in all its forms, projects on nuclear submarines, Stingray torpedoes, and experimental anti-submarine wire-guided vehicles. The Royal Navy finally weighed anchor at Portland Naval Base on the 20th of July 1995. In beautiful sunshine, the shoreside white ensign was lowered, while a 13-gun salute echoed around the island's east cliffs. As the last Flag Officer Sea Training, Rear Admiral John Tolhurst sailed out of the harbour, heading for Plymouth on HMS Argyll. The emotional occasion was witnessed by 11 admirals of the fleet, many local dignitaries and hundreds of civilian staff who were facing redundancy. The symbolic keys of the former Portland Naval Base were handed over to the new private owner, Portland Port Limited, on the 29th of March 1996. It is ironic that the savings made by the Navy's move from Dorset to Devonport made possible investment in new state-of-the-art Type 23 frigates, including one to be named HMS Portland. Commissioned in 2000, Portland rapidly developed a great affinity with Weymouth and Portland through her frequent operational and social visits. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, returned to Dorset in 1995 as senior pilot of 815 Naval Air Squadron. He now commanded over 80 aircrew, 420 ground staff and 41 helicopters, the largest flying unit in the Fleet Air Arm. However, the departure from Portland of naval ships left the Royal Naval Air Station helicopter base in some difficulty. The ships they now served and exercised with were now based 60 miles away. In July 1995, a statement by Malcolm Rifkind, Secretary of State for Defence, sealed the fate of the Royal Naval Air Station. His Frontline First report announced that Portland's long association with the Royal Navy was to end totally. In 1998, 40 years of aviation at the Royal Naval Air Station Portland was coming to an end. To celebrate its achievements and rapport with the Dorset community, HMS Osprey threw everything open to the public on the 17th of October. Sunshine and a fresh breeze welcomed thousands of people on the day they called End of an Era, to see on display every type of helicopter which had flown there, from the earliest Westland Dragonfly to the latest Lynx. Prince Andrew landed in the maroon Sikorsky helicopter of the Queen's flight and proceeded to inspect the displays and mingle with people. He was accompanied by Osprey's final commanding officer, Captain John Harvey. A Sea Harrier showed its aerial talents, and pilots of 815 Squadron gave an impressive aerobatic display. The band of the Royal Marines beat retreat before Prince Andrew stepped onto the dais to take the final salute, while the white ensign was lowered. The rundown of HMS Osprey was completed on the 31st of March 1999. The last Lynx flew off to the west. The Royal Naval School of Helicopter Control moved to HMS Heron at Yeovilton, Somerset, and the Fleet Target Group moved to HMS Seahawk at Culdrose, Cornwall. Britain's largest naval air station then metamorphosed into Osprey Quay, a huge maritime business and leisure venue. Here now is the headquarters of the Royal Yachting Association, a 600-berth mariner, Sunseeker luxury yacht maker, and Weymouth and Portland National Sailing Academy, the base for the 2012 Olympic sailing events. Portland Harbour in its commercial guise is more peaceful than it's ever been. But the Royal Navy retains a few rights. Warships still visit and exercise in the area, and the acoustic and degaussing ranges are still operational. The port has authorised berthing for nuclear submarines, and the Royal Marines in the Special Boat Service continue to do their vital training in the area from their very active Poole base. The changes have been phenomenal, and in 2012 the senior service was facing decimation through cuts on an unprecedented scale. However, in the 21st century, Dorset can look back with pride over the role the county has played over hundreds of years in the Royal Navy's defence of this great maritime nation.